Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our second open forum of the Housing Accountability and Production Office. Excited to be here with colleagues, DLCD and our partners around the state. I'm Joel Matson, the Housing Accountability and Production Office Manager, and really be handing it over to my colleagues, Lauren and Kieran, to be diving in this afternoon. Look forward to having a brief presentation from our team, and then we'll be able to open it up for more of a Q&A session here after we navigate a brief presentation. Again, thank you for joining us. Lauren?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lauren Dressen. I am the lead housing navigator with the Housing Accountability and Production Office. Really excited to be here with you this afternoon, and thanks for joining us. So just a quick overview of what we're going to be chatting about today. We're going to give a little overview of what our office does and what the purpose of our office is. And then the majority of our time we're going to be spending on our mandatory adjustment process. And then we'll definitely have time for questions at the end, should you have any. So quick overview about the Housing Accountability and Production Office. Really the purpose of our office is to boost housing production via support to developers and cities. So we kind of work, we have our foot in sort of both areas. And our fully operational date is July 1 of this year. That being said, there are a few things such as the mandatory adjustment process that we'll be talking about that was operational clearly before July 1. And so, we're starting to really build our outreach and make connections with both cities and our development community. So our approach to this work is really, while we do have enforcement capabilities as part of our office's work, we are really focusing on collaboration first. So doing everything that we can to collaborate with cities and developers, provide guidance, technical assistance, and avoid enforcement where absolutely possible. And so there's a lot of things that our office is tasked with doing, but we've got kind of 5 things here that are a quick overview of what we do. So we ensure local land use codes and decisions meet state law. We provide technical assistance and funding for local governments. We provide research and guidance to reduce barriers in productions. Some examples of this are model code and ready build plans. We also, as I mentioned, resolve disputes prior to formal appeals processes where we can. And then provide voluntary compliance mechanisms and, if necessary, mandatory compliance. So our office, which is this is a kind of a new thing. I've never seen something quite like this in state government that's very exciting, is that our office is actually jointly managed across 2 state agencies. So Department of Land Conservation Development, which is the folks here today that are talking, but we also are jointly managing this office with the Building Codes Division, which is housed within the Business and Consumer Department of Consumer and Business Services as well. So the real role there is to enhance agency coordination across the whole housing development cycle. So there are 2 other agencies listed here. Business Oregon and Oregon Housing Community Services Department are the other 2 large state agencies that have play a big part in the housing development cycle. And so they are definitely 2 other agencies that we will be in close collaboration and coordination with through our office's work. And so our initial focus is certainly on opportunities within those 4 agencies shown. But no, there are many, many other state agencies who have some hand or influence on regulating or providing funding throughout the housing development cycle. So with that, I will pass it over to Kieran Turnbull to talk about the mandatory adjustment process.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren, and good to see everyone. My name is Kieran Turnbull, and I'm the Housing Navigator with the Housing Accountability and Production Office, also known as HAPO. And we wanted to spend a fair amount of time today talking about the mandatory adjustments to housing development standards. And this is a provision that was introduced in Senate Bill 1537 in the last legislative session in 2024. And essentially it provides developers a number of flexibilities to housing and design standards that local governments essentially must approve if a developer meets certain criteria that I'll talk about in a little bit. So Lauren, you can go to the next slide. So I also wanted to kind of open this conversation with an example that has already been used with the mandatory adjustments. So housing developers are already kind of, seeing that this bill has come into place and are already using this in their own development projects. So the Owens Adair is an apartment building in Astoria, Oregon, and you can see a rendering of it in the middle of the screen. And the lead developer is the Northwest Oregon Housing Authority. And essentially it's creating 50 units that are affordable to low-income households. And it primarily serves seniors, people with disabilities, and people experiencing homelessness. And Lauren, you can flip to the next slide. So essentially the city required a parking requirement of 0.65 spaces per bedroom, which accounted to 62 total parking spaces for this development. And with the nature of the development application and how they were trying to situate the actual building itself, this would require the developer to create an underground parking unit. And with that comes a number of geotechnical analyses that have to be done. And with that came a number of appeals from local citizens. But essentially, the developer was able to use the mandatory adjustment provision and removed and lowered the number of parking spaces that was required for this development from 62 to 8. And now this development is going to be breaking ground soon. And since they lowered the number of parking spaces, it made this development feasible and also sped up the application and permitting process greatly. So housing developers can essentially apply for one of these adjustments to a housing development or design standard if they meet these criteria listed here. And a city must approve the developer if they meet these criteria listed here. So the first one is that the housing development is in city limits within the urban growth boundary and also zoned to allow for residential uses, which also includes mixed use. The housing development also must meet density requirements based on location of the project. And the specific density requirements are listed in the bill 1537. But essentially these density requirements kind of vary on the size of the city and where the development is proposed. So within the metro urban growth boundary, for example, the development must be at least 17 dwelling units per net residential acre. And then for smaller cities, such as cities under population 2,500, it must be 5 dwelling units per net residential acre. And they kind of scale across the different sizes of cities within Oregon. And the development also must create net new housing units. And what this means is essentially the development must be creating more housing units than is already currently on that piece of land. So a housing developer couldn't use these adjustments to remodel their single unit dwelling and keep that dwelling to only have one unit. The adjustments must be used to increase the number of units on the parcel of land. And then also, I think number 4 is a really important part of this bill, but essentially it lists a number of criteria that also a developer must meet to be granted one of these adjustments. And in the past, with state legislation related to incentives for housing, I think we've seen a huge focus on affordable housing units that are available to citizens that meet a certain area median income percentage. But really this adjustment applies to market rate and but also affordable housing. So for example, a developer that can prove that the adjustment will increase the number of units as seen in 4C right here. If they can prove that the adjustment will increase the number of units in their application, they can be granted an adjustment. But then also this applies to your regulated, affordable, accessible, or shared limited equity units. And you can go to the next slide. So I also wanted to review, right, what are the design and development standards that a housing developer could actually request an adjustment for. So these are listed in the table right here. On the left-hand side of the table, you can see all of the development standards. And on the right-hand side of the table, you can see all of the design standards. And there's a couple key points I wanted to make related to these. One is a developer can only request up to 10 distinct adjustments. And essentially what that means is each one of these rows, so for example, 4A, side or rear setbacks, that would be like one adjustment. And this can be a little bit confusing because if you see on the right-hand side of the table, there's 5C, which is roof forms and materials, which would seem like it's two adjustments because like roof form is one standard and materials is also one standard. But under this bill, 5C, both roof forms and materials counts as like one adjustment. So a developer can request up to 10 of these listed in this table. And then different adjustments have different levels of like applicability. So for example, going back to the 4A, you see side to rear setbacks. The developer can only adjust side or rear setbacks up to 10% under this provision. But we'll see some of the other standards don't have a parentheses that has a limitation on the adjustment. So essentially, a developer would be able to request a full adjustment for those. So for example, 4C parking minimums, a developer would be able to request a full adjustment to those, meaning if the city required 10 spaces for a development, they could lower that to 0. And then multiple of these also have asterisks next to them. And that means that the adjustment is only applicable to manufactured dwelling parks, middle housing, multi-unit, and mixed-unit residential developments. You can go to the next slide. And feel free to use the raise hand function to interrupt me if you have any questions. But I'm sure you're also curious, what are the processes used to apply for these adjustments? So local governments must follow what's called a limited land use decision. And this can kind of take different forms depending on how the local government implements limited land use decisions. Sometimes you'll see it as a type 1 or type 2 decision. But the housing developer can submit this request for adjustment with following the local land use process when you're submitting an application for your housing development. But I think the part I really wanted to highlight here is the key part of a limited land use decision is that after a decision is made by the local government, only the applicant may appeal the decision. So it's not available to appeal by people outside of the applicant. And then also no notice of decision is required if the application is denied, other than notice to the applicant itself. So this is intended to be a little bit faster than some of the other land use decisions that require public comment or notice of other interested parties. You can go to the next slide. So I guess I'll stop here for a second if anyone has any questions. Great. So the next piece I wanted to focus on is the exemption process. So local governments can apply to the Housing Accountability and Production Office for an exemption to the mandatory adjustments process. And I really wanted to emphasize that this exemption isn't allowing the local government to not accept adjustments to the design and development standards that we listed above, but instead this exemption is allowing the local government to follow their own process and approval criteria rather than the approval criteria that we listed above. So it allows the local government to keep using their local processes that they've already had in place, as long as they can prove to the HAPO office that they are meeting a certain set of criteria that I'll talk about in the next slide. So essentially to apply for an exemption, the local government sends an application to the HAPO office, and the local government must demonstrate the 3 criteria listed on this slide. So the first is that the local government reviews all requested design and development adjustments for housing applications. So they accept adjustments to development and design standards in the first place. Number two is that they accept adjustments and applications for those adjustments for all of the development and design standards that are eligible under the mandatory adjustment exemption mandatory adjustments. So that table I listed above. And then the local government also has to prove that they've approved 90% of adjustment requests in the previous 5 years, or they can go down this other path by proving that they have a flexible process that accommodates for project needs by providing developer testimonial. And under these parameters, the HAPO will be able to determine if the local government should be granted an exemption to this or not. So we have a review timeline for these exemption applications. The whole timeline takes about 120 days, and there's a 45-day public comment period that is baked into that. And I really want to stress to local developers that this public comment period is available to you all to provide testimonial and your experiences as a developer who has used the adjustment process for the city, because a lot of information can't be just deemed from the application itself. The application, while it's pending and the HAPO is reviewing it, it's a couple key things that I also want to note. One, the local government must provide notice to current applicants in the development process that they have filed for an exemption. And during this exemption period, the local process is the one that shall be used instead of the mandatory adjustment process that was described earlier. So the local government can essentially temporarily operate on under an exemption while their application is in. And then once the exemption is either approved or denied, if the exemption is approved, there may be conditions for approval. So the HAPO can put different conditions that essentially require the local government to demonstrate compliance, that they're meeting the 90% threshold, or they're continuing to approve adjustments. And then also, if there's a complaint that the local government isn't following the adjustment process or isn't granting adjustments to the development and design standards listed earlier in this presentation, exemptions may be revoked. And you can go to the next slide. And I guess I'll hand it off to Lauren to talk about how we're tracking these exemption applications.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, so I wanted to show, and we'll make sure we drop the link to this dashboard in the chat if you do not already have it. So we have created basically a dashboard, and it's for cities and developers, but cities who are engaging with this process, we're engaging with them behind the scenes. They kind of know what the status of their particular application is. But this tool was really created to show, yes, where there's an application process happening, but even more so, all of these adjustments are fully in play as of January 1st. And so everywhere where there's not an application, developers can ask for, like Karen said, up to 10 of those adjustments and start doing that immediately. And so just to kind of zoom in here, if you click on a particular city, it shows you what, City of Salem has submitted an application. It shows you sort of their process and key dates. And then there's a table that shows all of those specific adjustments, what exemptions that particular city asked for. And I want to point out something really, really important here is that there is a, in all caps, submit public comment now. And that is where we, when we think about engagement with developers, you can actually submit public comment straight through this tool. And so we really encourage you, as you are, have experiences working with different local jurisdictions and have feedback to give on their particular process, we really encourage you to engage in that way. That helps us give a full picture of kind of what is that local process, what is working, what's challenging, and that gives us kind of a full scope of not just through the permit history that is provided through the application process, but then actually hearing from folks on the ground who are interacting with that process. So please, like I said, we'll drop the link to that in the chat so you have it. Please bookmark it and check back regularly. We keep it up to date, like to the day, as we get new applications or an application moves to kind of the next step in the process. So I think I'm going to kick it back to Kieran for the final slide.
Yeah, so I also wanted to note that this is a temporary policy. So this policy will sunset on January 2nd, 2032. And then I also want to highlight that cities will be submitting data to the HAPO, and that will include the number of permits that were submitted using a mandatory adjustment or an adjustment, so we can continue to monitor if cities are still granting these adjustments. And then the HAPO will also report to the legislature on the implementation of this, and we'll also include the League of Oregon Cities to provide feedback on the report. So that's another thing to keep an eye out for if you're curious about the implementation of this statute and kind of how housing developers are utilizing these adjustments and what it's looking like on the ground.
All right. So before we jump into questions and discussion, I don't want to put, I think I see Rachel and Ryan, and I wanted to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves as well, especially as we get into questions, and depending on how technical the questions are, I think Rachel and Ryan might be able to help us out on answering some of those questions. So Rachel, I don't know if you want to go ahead.
Sure. Hi, I'm Rachel Six. I'm a housing planner with the HAPO team. I've been working with our senior housing planner, Sean Edging, developing this exemption process, so I might be able to help answer some questions. Sean couldn't be here today, but if anyone has questions, I'm happy to help where I can.
And my name is Ryan Markwart. I'm with the LCD in the HAPO office, and I'm also a housing planner, kind of working alongside Rachel and Sean. So I can chime in if I happen to know the answer on anything, but otherwise, really curious to hear what questions and comments folks have.
Thank you both. Well, we'll go ahead and just open it up. Feel free to come off of mute or throw things in the chat. Any questions or thoughts that you might have.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah,
Thank you. My name is Brittany Randall, and I'm a land use consultant, mostly in Salem. I work in other smaller jurisdictions. What would you say to developers who are nervous about utilizing these adjustments? Their fear is like retaliation in smaller jurisdictions that are not really excited about developing multifamily housing within their boundaries. Is there any way to ensure that there wouldn't be any sort of retaliatory conditions of approval or other sets of items that could maybe cause the project to sort of fall off the rails?
Joel, I'm gonna call on you on this one.
Sure. Thanks, Lauren, and Brittany, thanks for your question. One of the core functions of our office is to make sure that we're a resource again to the development community and partnering with our local jurisdictions. So at our core is we're helping to ensure that there's application of the statewide housing laws, and that's happening throughout the state consistently. So, you know, these adjustments that we've presented on this afternoon, that is state law. And so if a developer is experiencing issues where there isn't appropriate application of state law, our office wants to hear about it and wants to work with you and the local jurisdiction to navigate that appropriately. So I know, you know, we've focused in on this process that's before us as far as applications for exemptions, right, to the statewide mandatory adjustments. That's one area for engagement, but we hope to have other area, you know, there will be other areas and opportunities to engage with our office, you know, going forward and outside of the application process. I think it was mentioned certainly as part of the conditions of approval and our office's work going forward to ensure that it continues through the end of the law, the period of time with which this law is in place. So we certainly want to hear from developers in that context. We're continuing to work on setting up a system that is an intake process for our office to be able to receive complaints of potential violations of housing laws. And that's one of the deliverables for our office by July 1 of this year, is that we'll have a system by which we can receive those complaints more formally from development community and others throughout. So hopefully that answered your question. And really at the core of it is we want to be building that relationship. We want you to know as a developer that we're here to support you in the development process, and again, to ensure that statewide housing laws are being implemented across the state.
Joel, and I would add, just to like touch on something that Kieran said that I think is a really important point, is that the exemption application is not an exemption from these adjustments. It is to allow them to use their local process, because they've demonstrated that that local process is flexible enough and is granting enough, hitting that 90% threshold of granting adjustments. So I say that to just really empower you all that those adjustments are there for you to utilize, and even an approved application does not exempt them from granting those adjustments. It just allows them to use their local process.
And I had another question, not to hog all the time, but we had participated heavily in the city of Salem's exemption application. I had rallied some of my peers in the industry to sort of like provide feedback and some real life things that we've faced submitting applications to Salem for housing specifically. And knowing that Salem was the first jurisdiction to submit an application to you for this exemption, do you guys kind of know how I had asked Kieran in the chat, do you guys know how it's going to go as far as receiving public comment? Like, are you giving jurisdictions the opportunity to provide rebuttal, or are you just making a decision based off of the application that you've received and then the information that you received from public comment?
This is where I so wish Sean was here to help answer that a little bit more. Rachel or Joel, I don't know if you want to jump in on that.
I haven't seen any cities offer rebuttal yet. I've only seen the testimony from the Salem developers come in. So yeah, I'm unsure about that. That's a good question. I'm happy to check with Sean on that and follow up with you, Brittany.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.
And I guess I could lean into, like, we don't have a process set up to allow for that, where there's like a publishing of the public comment necessarily at this point. So we've just been in the receipt of those public comments, and we have a time frame as an office by which we need to be making the determination on that application. You know, I understand, and we've certainly seen this and heard from development community that at times, you know, an housing development application is and a request for adjustments don't really happen in the formal permitting process because of conversations that are happening around that housing development application. And I just want to emphasize the importance, a couple of things. One, the importance of in testimony, like if we can see where particular housing development applications have actually formally requested adjustments, right? And better understand that process. that's really informative to our office to determine, you know, is the local process actually providing the flexibilities that are intended to be provided. So that's the sort of public comment that's really important to hear from developers. Again, another point that I'll just make is encourage folks to sign up for, in which we're responding to every developer that submits public comment, opportunities to sign up for our email blast and information, so you can just track the status of the application for a particular jurisdiction that you may be interested in. And
Great,
so maybe
yeah.
Kieran, if I could ask you to put in the chat, kind of if you can find that link for where folks can sign up as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, hi, my name is Stephen Wild. I'm with CASA Initiative here in Lane County. And I want to kind of piggyback on what Brittany had asked regarding pushback from local jurisdictions as far as maybe kind of delaying the development process. We specialize in offsite prefab modular development. On a larger scale, like high density. So like we have a project we're working on that's 550 units on a 4-acre, that's a 4-acre lot here in Lane County, and it's mixed use, multifamily. What can you talk a little bit about what support from you guys looks like with the local jurisdiction when developers receive, I don't know if necessarily pushback is the right word, but just kind of delaying the entitlements process?
I can take a stab at that. I know like when in order to be eligible for an exemption, we're going to be requiring them to show that they have an application review process and timeline. So that is part of the criteria for to be able to grant an exemption. And just because HOPO grants an exemption, the process is not over at that point. Senate Bill 1537 includes requirements for providing notice to developers on what their local processes are and what process applies to each standard. And so that will be a condition of approval we expect in most of our, if a city does qualify for that approval. And there's also language in the bill that covers all of the conditions under which an exemption can be revoked. So that's in subsection 6 of section 39. So I'd encourage everyone to become familiar with that. And those conditions of approval will be clearly documented in any decision HOPO makes.
Awesome, thank you.
Can I ask another question? Sorry. When speaking with the city of Salem about why they submitted to be exempt from these mandatory adjustments, at least in this way, they had said something like their department actually worked with the state to create this exemption piece of the bill. And given the governor's appetite for bringing more housing, I'm shocked to see that there was an exemption at all, especially on something that sunsets. So is there any feeling from the HAPO or DLCD about, you know, really holding these jurisdictions' feet to the fire to really prove that they meet these exemption criteria? Because it seems like it's in everybody's best interest to just blanketly across the board have everybody comply with Senate Bill 1537. Like, I see no benefit to anyone having an exemption from this. Just to really put my opinion out there.
Oh, I'm looking to you again on that one.
I think, thank you for sharing your opinion, Brittany. And this is an opportunity for the Housing Accountability Production Office to really lean into. You know, we're not a policy making body. We're a body that it helps enforce the housing laws that have already been adopted across the state. So it is our obligation as an office to ensure that the housing laws are being equitably applied throughout the state. And to your point about the exemption, I can't speak again, we're not a policymaking body, but just to emphasize that an exemption from these adjustments, from the statewide mandatory adjustments, is not saying that the adjustments aren't in play. It's saying that there's a local process that allows similar or better adjustments in the housing development process. So again, I guess we can't say that enough. It's an exemption from a state required process versus utilizing a local process that allows those flexibilities. That's the exemption that's in play as it relates to the mandatory adjustments in Senate Bill 1537. And Kieran, I see you come off mute, please chime in there.
Yeah, Brittany, another thing that, if you're curious to follow up with the city of Salem, for example, if the city does get approved for an exemption, there will likely be approval criteria within that, approval for the exemption. And part of that will be likely to, continue to prove that they accept adjustment applications to a certain threshold, and that they still, accept exemptions for the number of design and development standards listed in the bill. So the city will still be required to, meet those things through the conditions of approval. And that's another thing important for you to monitor, to keep, as you're like the check in the ballots to the city, to ensure that the city is continuing to meet these standards.
To build on that too, the fully operational on July 1 is that intake process of inquiries and complaints and questions and things. And while that's when we are formally going to be accepting that, we certainly are getting questions and inquiries every single day. And so as you're engaging with cities and asking for adjustments, if you are running into snags or barriers, that is the purpose of our office. And so don't be shy to reach out to us and ask us questions, or say, hey, does this fall within this mandatory, please reach out with not just that, but any questions and or concerns that you may have, and we can help you sort of navigate that. That's why we're here. So please use us as a resource as you're navigating, applications and things with local jurisdictions and starting to request those mandatory adjustments.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think I'm really confused about the fact that you guys are saying they're just adjusting out of the state's process, not adjusting out of the fact that they have to go ahead and approve these adjustments just the same. Okay, interesting. So I submitted a bunch of testimony for the city of Salem specifically, and I gave eight project examples of where we're essentially held hostage at like completeness review. And there is language in the completeness letters that we're receiving saying we don't support this adjustment. So we are left to either persevere and face potential denial, or withdraw and resubmit a different adjustment, or face possibly heavy conditions of approval that would be costly or unreasonable to meet. So I've submitted all of that to you guys, so I don't, mean to hash it out here on your forum here, but this is just why the development community is desperate for you guys to hold their feet to the fire when you're reviewing this application, because there's a lot more that's happening besides what the city has submitted to you for review.
Thank you, Brittany.
Yeah, again, thanks for your engagement in this process, and we're certainly in receipt of your public comment and are reviewing that as part of the application process with the city of Salem, as we will with other jurisdictions that request that they utilize the local flexible process versus the state required process.
And I'll just say too, I shared the link to the dashboard in the chat. Just as of today, we've had nine jurisdictions that have submitted an exemption application. Salem is the only one outside of kind of the Portland metro area, but the remainder of the applications are there. And Salem's public comment period just closed today. And we've got 2 other public comment periods open at the moment. So like I said, please engage in that way if you have experiences of interacting with the local process and have comment on that. We welcome it. Happy Valley and the city of Sandy are both open for public comment at the moment, with a few more will be following in the next week or 2.
I had a quick question.
Yes, please.
So for the standards that are laid out, can you add more standards, or what would that process look like if there were other things that we're finding versus the 20 something on that table in the previous slides to add? Is that having to go back through the house? Is that to your guys' delegation, or how could potential things either be added or adjusted or expand scope, for lack of a better word, for mandates?
At this time, we're limited to what's in the bill. So yeah, only those standards that were specifically outlined in section 38.
Okay, got it.
Yeah,
Thank
and Blake, I think it would have to go through the legislature again to make an edit to the bill if there were to be additional standards added.
And I think that it was called out in that way so specifically so that it wasn't kind of ambiguous. It's like this list and only this list. And it was written in a way to try to be very clear about what those particular adjustments were.
Got it.
Let's see, other questions, and we are happy to take other questions, maybe not just about the mandatory adjustments, but any other questions you have about our office and the purpose of our office. We would be happy to answer any questions on that as well.
I'm going to jump in since nobody else is. So just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, your organization really serves as like the primary purpose is to support and advocate for developers who are maybe facing pushback or just wanting to work with the new adjustments to bring additional housing online according to what the governor's goals are. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, you are, Stefan. But I think the scope of our office is also broader than just the mandatory adjustments. We kind of have like 2 wings of the HAPO office. One is related to housing laws and compliance of housing law. So there's a whole list of different housing laws that we'll have published. But essentially, if you submitted an application to a city or county related to the development of housing and you think that the city or county is out of compliance with one of those, you can submit an inquiry to our team, and then we can investigate that to see the validity of it, and then work with the city and county and collaborate with them to remedy the solution. And those housing laws both apply to land use. So you might be familiar with like the recent middle housing laws, clear and objective standards, but then also on the building code side of thing. And like Lauren mentioned in the presentation, we're partnered with the Building Codes Division. And if you have questions related to building codes as well, they're a great resource that we can connect you with. And then there's kind
Awesome.
of,
And then,
oh yeah,
oh,
go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and then I guess the other side of the shop is like a state resource navigation, which is what Lauren and I are helping lead. And that essentially, there's so many resources throughout the state related to housing in terms of grants, loans, technical assistance. And we're working on kind of working with those state agencies to compile all those resources into one location to make it easy for developers to navigate and find like, oh, where can we find a Department of Energy grant for efficient heat pumps, and where can we find infrastructure loans and things like that to make it easier for developers to kind of navigate, because all those resources are kind of siloed right now.
That's fantastic. That was what my next question was going to be. So you guys will work with, like, say, OHCS if developers are trying to bring in innovative development elements to their projects, and say, I don't know, just for example, like OHCS staff maybe not as familiar with some of those innovations and how to fund them. That's where you guys can also come in and assist developers. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's both the kind of coordination, helping coordinate resources, and just my unofficial title is one-stop coordinator, and I keep using that. It's like a one-stop shop for, instead of having to go to 30 different web pages on 30 different state agency websites, but it's pulling it all together, and Karen and I, having enough understanding of kind of the variety of programs that are out there, knowing the contact people, and helping sort of help developers figure out whether there's a funding source that would be helpful for their project, either to elevate it or potentially close a gap that you have that's been identified. Like, we started digging around and realized that we have, an extra $500,000 in septic work that we need to do. We didn't build that into our pro forma. How do we adjust and, help, go, hey, Business Oregon has a septic program, and we'll get you connected with those folks. And then there's also Palmer Mason, who's on our team, he kind of does the interagency coordination at a high level. So really looking at sort of efficiencies and how agencies are working together and how policies and regulations are working together. That's really his role. So it's kind of the really high level. And then Kieran and I are really in the weeds on actual, like, when are notice of funding allocations open, and, policy changes where maybe a new group of developers can apply for a funding source that they couldn't previously, or there's a new infusion of money or a brand new program for housing production. So it's kind of at both levels. And I really see that on the ground, Kieran and I on the ground working directly on particular developments where, Stephen, maybe you're saying, oh, we're struggling with this thing, that we then elevate that up and think about at a really systemic level, hey, this maybe isn't working, and we're seeing if development's struggling with braiding these funds together or utilizing this resource. So it's a little if it's both, kind of, I guess. I don't know if that was like a long way to try to answer your question, but
No, that was amazing. Thank you.
okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
There's my
Yeah.
thank you. That's my elevator speech now for what we do.
Yeah. No, that's great. And so even though this doesn't come online, you guys officially until July 1st, is it okay to, like, reach out early so that we can
Yes.
get ahead of some of these
Please
things?
do. Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't know, did we drop our general email address in the chat? We will if we haven't.
Okay. I don't think
It's
I saw it.
Yeah, we'll drop it in there so you have it. And we all monitor our inbox, and we're already receiving questions, inquiries, complaints, musings to that inbox. So please, even though we're not officially up and running, it's actually really helpful for us to get a sense of what's going on out there, and that's going to help inform what our inquiry and complaint process looks like going forward too. So we're really using, we're helping where we can, and it's really, really helpful for us as we're standing up our office to understand what the needs of both cities and the development community are.
Awesome. Thank you. That's fantastic. It's really great to know that you guys are out here doing this.
Hi, I'm going to jump in. I'm Lydia Ness. I'm with Cascadia Partners, and a lot of the jurisdictions we have worked with, have asked about the ready build plans. And I'm kind of curious if there's a timeline related to that at all, or when we can start to expect some of those plans coming online.
Joel, I think this might be a question for you. I'm not super familiar with the timeline for those plans.
Now I'm like trying to look through the Senate bill here, see if is there a specific timeline due date on those. I don't know, Joel, if you know the answer
It
to
is,
that.
so it is a purpose of our office. I'd like to circle back with you on more of a timeline. I think just to be clear, you know, with the operational date of July 1, there are certainly kind of the first tier focus of our office. And while we're also trying to advance other statutory obligations that were provided to us in Senate Bill 1537. So to include the ready build plans. So I know happy to circle back with you when we have a better sense of what that timeline looks like. Great to hear that there's some excitement around that. And I guess I would just say we'd like to harness that excitement and to help informing that whatever product we are able to produce is well informed by our partners and that will really work well for application around the state. So we'll circle back with you directly on timeline and look forward to your engagement in that as we move forward.
Great, yeah, thanks so much, Joel. And the Dalles was one of the cities that we worked with that were excited, and I know worked with you on that. So yeah, great. Thanks for that update.
All right. I'm hearing a lull here. Any final questions or thoughts? And again, if you think of questions or you're not someone who wants to jump in a meeting with like 50 people, totally understandable. We dropped our email in the chat there. Please, if you've got questions after the fact, absolutely reach out to us and we will get back to you. And or if you want to, reach out and meet with us kind of on the site, we are happy to do that here. We're here to help and we are a resource to you. Any final thoughts from the HAPO team before we break? Okay. Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate your time this afternoon.
Thanks so much for attending. Have a good
Thank you
afternoon.
all.
Thank you, guys.